So before we get started looking at code, I wanted to make sure that we spent some time looking at the documentation and the resources that are available. You can find it all at docs.clevu.com. Specifically, when you load the page, what we're going to be looking at is going to be the template.js. From here, you'll be introduced to an overview of how the library works. It explains that under the hood, what's actually happening is that we're using the search query API, which is actually called the storefront APIs in the documentation. And then it explains a little bit about the library, the files that make it up. These files, I would consider this like the Clevu.js is what we call core, and it's because it's like the core functions. It's the base object that everything is derived of. It's helper functions. It's the library, the building blocks that make the whole entire library possible. From there, we have what we would consider theme files for quick search, which is kind of like autocomplete or search as you type. Then there's the search result landing page. Then there's the category page, which is category merchandising. It's actually called CatNav in our code. By the way, quick is quick search. So that's what we call it in the code, is called quick. Search result landing page or search result page, we call that landing in the code. And then there's also Clevu Rex, which is also called Rex. From there, it also explains that our library is essentially built using HTML templates. And then there's also analytics API that's intertwined in all of the code, so you don't have to worry about it. It's just all kind of baked in. From here, there's a Get Started section, which talks about the Smart Search. Smart Search is basically a combination of Quick Search or Quick and search result landing page or landing. And then there's an example that just kind of shows how you would basically put, a basic HTML page together in order to see the code run and what's like the minimum of what you actually need. From there, there's a similar page for the category merchandising or CatNav. There's another one for Rex. There's another section that gives you very useful links on the apps or the plugins or what we would call the Clevu apps for the major platforms like Shopify, BigCommerce, and Magento. So if you're on one of those platforms, you might want to take a look at those sections as well. Then the juicy part is under Build UI. From there, we kind of look at some high-level blocks of how the library itself works and what you can do with it as far as customization. So it's a great resource to better understand what your customization file is made up of and how you would go into that code to be able to make new adjustments or to modify things. So that's broken down into template customizations, which is how you would set templates, how you can reference the template library itself, like not the template, well, yeah, I guess it is the template library. It's essentially, it's the template reference. It's the names and the files where you can access the default template. So if you wanted to make a modification to a template that isn't already in an existing customization file that you're working with, and you wanted to make a new customization, you can come to this template reference, be able to find the file, download it, grab the chunk of code that you need for the template that you want to modify, and you have a reference to the name of that template because you have to call it by name. There's also a section on setting custom helpers, which is very, very good as far as being able to remove logic and functionality from the templates themselves and to keep them very lean and simple and straightforward. And then moving the heavy code out of the template itself, and then being able to access those that functionality through helpers that are available as the template's rendering. We'll get into that in a later video. Then there's a section on after template render, which is essentially a hook during the execution as things are happening. You can go in there and you can essentially run code after the templates have finished rendering. So if you needed to add an event handler to a button, this is the way that you would do it. This function always runs after the template has completed rendering. So you can trust that at this point, the buttons are on the page, the inputs are on the page, the divs, the spans, whatever it is that's being rendered by the templates, that it will be available to you. There's also a section that discusses styling in CSS. There's also another section that describes how the analytics work and little gotchas, things to watch out for to make sure that you don't modify the templates in a way that disconnects it from the functionality of the analytics, because the analytics is very crucial to the way the library works. Outside of this template customization section, there's another section about modifying requests. This essentially allows you to hook into the execution so that you can modify the request before it's made to the storefront API. So you can go to the storefront API and find out the different options that you have available in that API to manipulate the type of request that you're making. And that way you can add extra logic to decide that you want to do, that you want to pre-filter something based on XYZ, or when you land on a particular page, or if a user clicks on a button or something. So you have full control over modifying the request. And then likewise, when the response comes back, there's a hook into that functionality where you can modify the response before it gets rendered onto the page. And then there's a whole nother section on modifying recommendations, and there's various hooks that are very similar to this, to what we've been discussing as far as modifying the request, modifying the response, setting templates and helpers and all that kind of good stuff. And even the after template render functionality, the modify recommendation section has very similar functionality there as well. Then there's the library reference section. To be honest, the most useful portions of this is probably going to be the configuration. There's a table here that shows you the different objects, and field names are kind of like properties of the objects that you can then turn around and specify to manipulate the settings of how Clevu is going to behave. And so there's a description column that explains what each one of these are and what the default values are, what's required and what's not, all that kind of good stuff. And then in addition to that, there's another section here that I think is really good, which is versioning. This particular section not only references the default files that were in the quick start guide that we were looking at earlier, but one section that I'll bring your attention to is specifically these debug versions of the files, and we'll talk about that in a later video. After that, there's a how-to section. This is the last portion of this documentation for the template.js, and essentially what this is it's a collection of the most popular customizations that customers ask us for. And so we've gone ahead and created how-to guides on how you would execute some of these. Now, you might want to find these resources extremely helpful to you as you're creating your own customization and modifying your implementation of Clevu, because you can use this as inspiration or just to kind of get ideas of how you might want to execute the thing that you need, even though it's not exactly what's in the guide. There's just a lot of really useful little code snippets that are inside of here, as well as explanations of how the code works. So that being the case, I would encourage you to get familiar with the documentation on docs.clevu.com.